thus far, we've been mainly talking about the probabilities related to one specific event. So what's the probability that the slowpoke horse wins the Derby? 20%. Or what's the likelihood that we roll a 5 on a 6-sided die? 16.6 repeating percent. But we can turn to more interesting or elaborate questions if we allow ourselves to contemplate more than one event at a time, and ask questions about what's the likelihood that both of these happen or one of these events happen. And to do that, we're going to need to be a little more elaborate and specific about our Venn diagrams, and as well as with the math that we develop here. So we're going to take a look at a couple of Venn diagrams and how we work through first kind of adding probabilities together and then later multiplying, and how to decide when we need to use these tools. So when we think about multiple events, there's one important decision we want to keep in mind, and that is whether or not we are talking about and or. And so we're going to start with or, and the and or decision. The and or leads us into multiplication or addition. Okay, and so keeping track of if we're talking about and, so for instance, you've got a that both events are true, right? So you need or we're talking about the event where you draw a card and it's a heart, and another event where you draw a card and it's a king. So if we want both of those to occur, and so it's a king and it's a heart, and so that's a different question. It's only satisfied by the king of hearts than if we talk about or, right? So you either get a king or a heart, or the king of hearts would satisfy both, but the or leads to a different path and a different set of calculations we need to do. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is when we write out these questions and write out these probabilities, we need to be specific about the language we're using here, and specifically and or. So we're going to focus mostly on the addition here, and to do that, let's draw some Venn diagrams and talk about some various situations that come up. So if I ask people, what is your favorite social media app? Okay, the people would respond with just one option, right? And so if you said my favorite app is Facebook, then you would not have said that my favorite app is TikTok or any of the others. So what we have here is mutually exclusive events. Right? So I'm going to draw a Venn diagram. And within that Venn diagram, we have events. So some people may have said Facebook. Okay, and some people may have said TikTok, but no one said you can't say both. Okay, so if you can only say one response, there's no overlap of these Venn diagrams. Okay, the classic Venn diagram has overlap between the two circles, right? That's what we see in kind of the public sphere, or the kind of popular culture Venn diagram. But a Venn diagram here does not need to overlap, and in this case, they wouldn't overlap. Okay, so this is going to be treated slightly different than another question we asked here well, let's ask that question. So, favorite social media app versus, what if the question instead was, what apps do you have? What social media apps do you have? Okay, and now the questions, that's a different question, and so it's going to elicit a different structure of answers. And in this case, we could see overlap of the responses, and we probably would expect that, right? And so we may have Facebook, and we would also, again, have TikTok, but we would see a sizable overlap, and it likely is even more of an overlap than I've depicted here. But this middle part is people that have both apps. So we have to be mindful of what the question we're asking elicits as a response, and then how the interaction between various events comes out. So, for instance, this place in the purple is both, right? So this is people that have Facebook and TikTok, right? And so that's an important thing to keep in mind, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So let's return to the question first, though. Well, actually, we can delve into this. So, how do we calculate? So let's say we know some of these percentages. So the probability that someone has Facebook in America is probably something along the lines of 0.6. And we would also know the probability that someone has TikTok is somewhere maybe 0.3. Okay, I'm kind of making these up, but I think this is roughly true. But we also need to know, what is the probability of both? The probability of Facebook and TikTok. Okay, and we'll talk more about how we can calculate that in the future. But let's say we know it's 0.2. Now, if we want to think about what is the likelihood that somebody has Facebook or TikTok, okay, that might be an interesting question, and maybe those aren't the two most interesting, but let's just say you want to reach a certain percentage of people with an advertising campaign, and you're going to post it on Facebook and TikTok. What percentage of people do we think are going to be reached? So we want to figure out the probability that someone has Facebook. Just going to change colors again. The probability that somebody has Facebook or TikTok. Okay, and this or is very important. Notice it's different than this and. So or means we need to have a sum of, we're going to add up the different events. Now, the way we're going to do that, so the probability, so the general form here, the general rule of addition tells us the probability of A or B is the probability of A plus the probability of B minus, trying to fit this in here, the probability of A and B. Okay, that's an A plus B. So in our case, we need the probability. All right, so we need the probability of Facebook plus the probability of TikTok. But we also need to subtract off the probability of both. Okay, because we don't want to double count this. So when we add Facebook, when we put in the Facebook group here at 60%, if we then add the 30%, we total 90%. But some of those people, specifically the purple in here, are getting double counted, right? They are in both the 60% and the 30%. So we need to subtract that off just once, right? So you can think about it as, okay, if we counted it in the Facebook group, if these people got counted when we counted up all the Facebooks, then we need to count the TikToks, but only the TikToks that are not Facebook users, or vice versa, right? We just need to include the purple people in one of the two groups. Okay, and so our end result becomes 0.6 plus 0.3 minus 0.1, what do I have? 0.2. Okay, and so that becomes what is that? 0.7. So 70% have either Facebook or TikTok, which includes the people that have both. So this is the general rule. There's another rule of addition called the specific rule, and it's just a form of this. So we're going to jump back to the other question where we said, what is your favorite social media app? Now, there's no ability for overlap here. So we can write out our, what's the probability of Facebook or TikTok? But this is remember, this is a different survey question that we've asked. So we don't have the overlap anymore. So what we still can say, okay, the probability of Facebook plus the probability of TikTok minus, we can still write it out the same way. So when you're working with the general rule of addition, it always works, okay? But we don't have to necessarily add this last little part if we know that the two events are mutually exclusive, Facebook and TikTok, because this is 0, right? There's no chance the purple is 0. So maybe we didn't write these down, but maybe what's the probability that someone chose Facebook as their favorite app? Maybe it's 15%. TikTok, maybe it was 20%. And there's no chance that somebody wrote both. Okay, so when we have mutually exclusive events, we don't have to include this last little part. The purple is going to be 0, and so oftentimes you'll see people just drop that, and that's why, for instance, in your book, we have what's called the special rule of addition, and that's only applicable when you have mutually exclusive events. So we can't forget this last little part if we have that overlap. So just to finish out the example, this would become 0.35, right? 15% plus 20%. And so we could say 35% of respondents picked either Facebook or TikTok as their favorite event or favorite social media app. Again, this is kind of a unneeded, but you can always do the general. So this is if you only use these two, that's the special rule of addition. But we can continue to put it in the general rule. It's just that last part's always going to be 0 if there's no overlap. But we need to make sure we don't forget about it in these cases where we do have the overlap. So those are the kind of the two calculations we do when we have ORs, right? So this was all about OR, where both events satisfied it when we want Facebook or TikTok. Next, we'll talk about what happens when we have AND. So how do we deal with, we need both. And in fact, this purple area is an AND. So how do we go about calculating those solutions?